In the early days, Rome would come to expect all kinds of attacks from their neighbouring civilizations. Some were outright raids set upon them by the Aquaian and Volsci tribes, warriors who were fearsome and deadly, but not one that Rome was surprised by, considering the frequency of their attacks. Other skirmishes saw Rome as the instigators, as we saw in the last video, where the Fabii, a patrician family who decided to try their hands at being warriors, took the fight to the city of Veii, where they were ultimately decimated. In events like these, Rome would bite off more than it could chew, and the ramifications of this often resulted in the loss of territory, which would require the assembling of a resistance in order to take it back. This of course meant more bloodshed, more spent resources, and ultimately the loss of life. But unfortunately for Rome, these realities were not going away anytime soon. In fact, one might say that one of the biggest nightmares in terms of raids and assaults was right around the corner. In the year 390, the Romans were told of some distressing news that two neighbouring Etruscan towns that were well within the Roman sphere of influence had been raided, sacked, and totally violated. The Etruscans, who were so utterly overwhelmed by the tribe who had come upon them, reached out to Rome for help, and Rome, never one to back down from a confrontation, eagerly responded. But unbeknownst to Rome, the raiders of these towns were not the usual suspects, but instead a warlike tribe known as the Senones, those who were from the Celtic land of Gaul. Gaul was a region of Western Europe that dominated modern-day France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Germany, and the northern parts of Italy. Basically, these guys had the monopoly on a lot of territory, and dwarfed Rome by comparison. The people themselves, known simply as the Gauls, were thought to have emerged around the 5th century BC, and would spend the next 100 years expanding over the aforementioned areas of Western Europe. These Gauls, however, were not really a people, per se, but instead a collection of various different tribes, each with their own set of rules, custom, and codes. So it makes sense that they were able to cover such large spaces of land, because their movements were not dictated by a united coalition. The tribes simply went where they wanted, when they wanted. What made the Gauls so versatile, however, was that they were able to unite their forces to conduct large-scale military operations, despite their differences. The Gauls were also quite a menacing bunch, and certainly would have seemed that way to the Romans, who had not encountered such a type of people before. They were thought to be considerably taller than the Romans, with light skin and fiery red hair. To the Romans, these were a different type of men, imposing savages that were worrying to behold, let alone engage against in battle. A 4th century historian, Ammianus Marcellinus, tells us that the Gaelic men were terrifying, but that their wives were perhaps even more so. He described them as creatures with gleaming eyes, more stronger than their husbands, and that they were more than a match for a whole group of foreigners, especially when the women, with swollen neck and gnashing teeth, swings her great white arms and begins to deliver a rain of punches mixed with kicks, like missiles launched by the twisted strings of a catapult. Evidently, the Gauls were not the type of people that anyone would want to mess with, let alone a relatively infant Rome that was still finding its way. The Romans would likely not have been prepared in any capacity to fight the Gauls, and upon seeing them, were probably already filled with trepidation. The fact that women were described as fighting as well, women who appeared to be just as ferocious as men, was not something that Rome would have a contingency for. Women, after all, did not fight in the Roman military, so this would come as something of a shock to the Romans. The very appearance of the Gauls would have been enough to strike some reserve into the Romans, these giant red-haired and pale men who at the time could very well have been pulled out of some storybook as far as the Romans were concerned. They were an anomaly, an intimidating one at that, and not one that the Romans were sure they could overcome. Spoiler alert, they didn't. The Romans would come to clash with the Gauls in around 390 BC in a battle known as the Battle of Alia, at the confluence of the Tiber and Alia rivers, just 10 or so miles from the north of Rome. As aforementioned, the battle came about because the neighbouring Etruscan towns, most notably Clusium, had requested Roman intervention after their city had been plundered. It is unknown for certain why the Gauls had marched upon Clusium, other than for general conquest or intended expansion. But one idea by Roman historian Livy is that Aruns, an influential noble in Clusium, had summoned the Gauls to sack the town because his wife had slept with the Etruscan king, known as Lucamo, a title given to the Etruscan ruler. There is an implication here that Aruns' wife had been taken against her will, and that Aruns wanted Lucamo to pay for it. The Gauls were sent for by Aruns, and it is understood that they proceeded to siege the city. In another account by Greek historian Dionysius of Halicarnassus, he goes into a little more detail behind Aruns' motivations, which differ slightly from Livy's. He tells us that Lucamo was already dying, and that prior to his death, he'd assigned guardianship of his son to Aruns. But when his son matured into a young man, he fell in love with Aruns' wife, and was able to seduce her. Devastated by this, Aruns went to the Gauls to sell wine, olives, and figs, and the Gauls, who were fascinated by these items, were eager to know of where they had come from. This seemingly innocent gesture, however, had a far more insidious undertone. For Aruns was not here to share Roman culture, nor even make a profit. He told the Gauls that these items had come from a very rich and fertile land that was inhabited by only a few people. People who were defenceless, weak, and ripe for the picking, and to bring devastation upon the people, so that they may have the land for themselves. The suggestion that the land would be easy to take was no doubt pleasing for the Gauls to hear, and so they were persuaded to instigate war. But Livy tells us that Rome was aware of the brewing tensions, and perhaps even more aware of the brute strength of the Gauls. As a result, they sought to prevent any sort of conflict from ever taking place, and so sent 3 ambassadors to negotiate in an effort for peace. The 3 ambassadors were the sons of Marcus Fabius Ambustus, one of Rome's most powerful aristocrats at the time, and the Pontifex Maximus, a title given to the chief of the high priests, and generally someone who had the authority when it came to the matters of religion. The 3 ambassadors met with the Gauls and urged them not to attack Clusium, because if they did, then Rome would have to step in and defend the town. Livy tells us that a deal for peace was struck, but on the condition that parts of Clusium were given to the Gauls. This unfortunately was not a stipulation that Rome or Clusium were willing to compromise on. Whilst Livy is vague on the accounts here, he tells us that an argument between the ambassadors and the Gauls took place, and that it escalated to such extremes that one of them killed a Senone chieftain. So yes, whilst Rome was sent here to mitigate the tensions, it seemed they'd only made them worse. The Gauls did not retaliate outright, but instead requested that the 3 ambassadors who they had quarrelled with pay for the life of their chieftain with that of their own. Whilst that seems fair and all, and sure would have saved a lot of bloodshed later on, it became a very tricky political matter. Remember, the 3 ambassadors were the sons of the powerful Pontifex Maximus, in Marcus Fabius Ambustus, and as a result of their familial ties, the Roman Senate were pressured not to surrender their lives. So as to avoid this political pitfall, and to avoid the blame if the Gauls defeated them, the Senate turned the matter over to the people, who would see the 3 ambassadors, likely as a result of various manipulations, honoured and vindicated. But of course, this did not sit well with the Gauls, who immediately took up arms against Rome. Livy wrote that Rome was rocked by terror and panic, and that, in response to the tumult caused by their swift advance, terrified cities rushed to arms, and the country folk fled. But the Gauls signified their shouts wherever they went, and their destination was Rome. It is unknown how large a force that the Gauls brought to Rome, but Greek biographer Plutarch argued that the Romans, despite the size of the Gauls' territory, were not outnumbered and at least had 40,000 at their disposal. However, most of these men were not militarily inclined or seasoned for battle. In fact, a good portion of them may not have even held a sword before. Dionysius of Halicarnassus acquiesces to the same idea, stating that Rome had 4 well-trained legions, but a larger portion of men were untrained civilians. Still, accounts differ as to just how many men the Romans had. Greek historian Diodorus Siculus tells that Rome had just 24,000 men at their disposal, whilst Livy makes no mention of quantity at all. Modern historians argue that the numbers of the Roman army at this point in time were much smaller than the suggestions by Plutarch, and argue that Rome only had 2 legions, as opposed to 4. Furthermore, it's argued that because the Gauls were just at Clusium, they could only have been a few days' march away from Rome, making it difficult for Rome to scramble together such a large volume of soldiers in time. As a result, it's possible that much of Rome's defence here would come about from militias and civilians. Meanwhile, the number of the Senones tribe who were coming to Rome are even more vague, with some historians suggesting anywhere between 10 to 20 or even 30,000 units. Amongst these units, though, was the Senone chief Brennus, a legendary figure that would be remembered for his ferocity in the coming conflict that would see Rome fall to its knees before him. Accounts of Brennus have often been conflated, and whilst it is agreed that Rome was bested by his ruthless tribe army, works such as Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain sought to paint him as a conqueror of epic proportions. In these works, he is seen as besieging Rome for 3 days, before eventually defeating the Romans along with his brother Belinus. According to these events, Brennus would come to occupy Rome and would stay there to occupy it as its ruler for the rest of his days. Livy and Diodorus Siculus, meanwhile, appear to be the only historians who have actual details of the battle. Livy tells us that despite the daunting look of the Gauls in their savage appearances and giant-like stature, the Romans did not take any special measures to combat them. However, this may have come at their detriment, because they were subsequently thunderstruck by the swiftness at which they moved, which is shown both by the haste in mustering the army, as if it were meeting a spur-of-the-moment emergency, and the difficulty in getting any further than the 11th milestone. Whilst Livy isn't quite as specific as one would hope, we do get a sense that the Romans had underestimated their Gallic enemies, or that because the tribe was so close to Rome, they were unable to muster up a formidable enough reception. It's possible then that the Gauls had the Romans outnumbered, or were far better skilled or equipped than the defenders. Livy tells us that the Romans did not even set up fortifications around the city, nor did they even consult their gods. He goes on that the soldiers attempted to widen their flank so as to avoid being attacked from the rear, but that this maneuver had made them scattered, thin, and easily overcome. There is an idea here that not only were the Romans caught at their most vulnerable, but also that there was a degree of incompetence on the behalf of the military, furthermore suggesting that these were not fighting men. Livy also makes note of Brennus, the Senone chieftain, as being present on the battle, and that his advancement into Rome sent the Romans into a panicked frenzy. We are told that much of the Roman defence threw down their weapons once Brennus had advanced, and that they had fled to the bank of the river Tiber. Here the Gauls were able to make light work of the fleeing soldiers, as they became confused and disorderly in their flight. The fleeing soldiers would try to cross the bank over to the safety of Veii, the neighbouring Etruscan city that ironically the Fabii had been raiding for their own amusement. But those who couldn't swim, or those whose armour was too heavy, were thought to have drowned. Ultimately, it was a unanimous victory for Brennus and the Gauls. Diodorus Siculus, meanwhile, has a slightly different account, and he states that the Romans marched to the river Tiber to confront the Gauls there. He states that the Romans had lined up 24,000 trained men upon the plain, and that the weaker, perhaps less combat-inclined soldiers had been placed upon a nearby hill. It was upon the hill, however, where the Gauls focused their attack, and so the weaker portion of the Roman resistance was easily decimated. Evidently, the Romans were not expecting the Gauls to attack the hill, and in a disorderly panic, they began to cross the river, only to be descended upon. Here, many of the Romans drowned, and those that did not had the fight and spirit stamped out of them. The Gauls proceeded to haul javelins at those who fled, and those that survived had the grim task of reporting the news that the army had been destroyed. Historians continue to argue as to exactly what happened after the battle had concluded, and while sources differ, there is a general agreement that Brennus and the Gauls sacked Rome. For one, Livy tells us that the Gauls were quite surprised at how easily they had overcome the Romans, and remained in place in more of a wary state than a triumphant one, almost like they were expecting reinforcements. Once they were sure that reinforcements weren't coming, they set off to Rome to continue the battle, only to find the gates of the city were wide open and no soldiers there to guard it either. Rightfully suspicious, they waited on the fringes of Rome to survey its activity, only to find that things really were as they seemed. As for Rome, its people had no idea that its soldiers had been battered, nor did they realise that the stragglers had fled to Veii. Worse yet, they were unaware of the hulking warriors that scurried around their walls, eyeing their city like hungry wolves. Once the Romans did become aware of the proximity of the Gauls, they sent everyone who was of a fighting age, including those amongst senators and their families who could hold a sword, to Capitoline Hill, where a fortress would need to be defended from Gaulish attack. The Vestal virgins were ordered to continue their ritual rites, whilst also carrying off the sacred objects and or burying them so that the Gauls could not get them. Many civilians chose to escape to the countryside, and with the threat of the Gauls looming over them, many were advised to do so. The very next day, the Gauls entered the city. They weren't brutish, ogresome savages hell-bent on destruction, but instead curious, inquisitive, and still most likely suspicious. The city streets would have likely have been empty, buildings barricaded, many abandoned, a sheer sense of desolation and vacantness. In fact, it wouldn't be until they reached the Roman Forum did they begin to encounter the resolute Romans who had remained, many of them the old noble patricians who had refused to be intimidated. Livy tells us that many of these men sat in the front yards of their mansions, eyeing the Gauls with defiance. But this had a certain effect on the Gauls, perhaps maybe a mutual respect, or maybe because they were struck by the magnificence of some of the patricians. These were the richest men in all of Rome after all, men who would wear sumptuous garbs, the sort that would make them seem radiant amongst others. To the Gauls, they would inspire a childlike awe, almost like they were beholding the gods themselves. Whether or not the Gauls were intent on harming these men is unknown, but Livy seems to believe that the Gauls, if anything, were struck with admiration. That is until one of the patricians struck one of the Gauls with his staff. He was the first to be murdered. The other patricians would then pay the same price, butchered in the chairs they sat in, and robbed of their fine possessions. Anyone else in the vicinity was also killed without hesitation, their houses pillaged and then set on fire. Livy continues that the Gauls set things on fire not to destroy the city, but instead to bait those who'd fled to Capitoline Hill into returning to save their homes, only to pounce on them the moment they did. But despite the carnage, those who had fled did not return. Despite their horrors at hearing the shouts of the Gauls, and the desperate shrieks of the innocent, the roaring of flames, and the collapse of buildings, the men on Capitoline Hill resolved to defend the hill at all costs, and so they did not return. After a few days, it is understood that they became hardened to the misery. The Gauls came to realize this when they'd run out of people to kill and buildings to burn. Upon this conclusion, they brought the fight to Capitoline Hill, but to their own detriment. You see, the Gauls had to ascend up the hill, and the Romans already had the high ground. Despite mostly being non-fighters and old men, the Romans were able to prevent the Gauls from advancing on them, and were said to have inflicted so many casualties upon them that the Gauls did not try to take the hill again. Livy continues that the Gauls did not give up though, and instead of trying to take the hill, sought to siege it instead. They divided their forces into two divisions, one that would besiege the hill, and the other to go about foraging in the neighbouring Roman territories. Some Gauls had the misfortune of visiting the ancient town Ardea, where a great military commander by the name Marcus Furius Camillus had been exiled on accusations of embezzlement. Camillus' moment of redemption came, however, when he rallied up the people of Ardea to fight against the Gaulish invasion. We are told that at night, he and his forces snuck into the Gaulish camp and murdered them all in their sleep. In another story, some Gaulish parties had arrived in the ancient town of Antium, a settlement they gravely underestimated, for they were surrounded by the townsfolk and killed. Back on Capitoline Hill, the Senone tribe had become slack in their siege. Either they were losing interest in Rome, or they were simply now weary from the circumstances. One story by Livy tells us of a patrician named Gaius Fabius Dorcio, who had the annual task of sacrificing to the gods upon Quirinal Hill. Supposedly, Dorcio carried the sacrificial instruments towards the Gaulish lines, and simply passed through them, without any resistance at all. He then made his way to Quirinal Hill, completed the sacrifice, and returned unhindered. It is unknown why the Gauls had allowed him to pass through their lines without interfering, but it's likely that they were fascinated by either his boldness or fascinated by his gods and the ritualistic rites he performed. Livy proposes another idea that the Gauls were restrained by their own religious feelings and allowed Dorcio to come and go freely out of respect to his gods. In the meantime, the Romans who had survived the battle and were now licking their wounds at Veii had finally regrouped. It was Quintus Caedicius, a centurion chosen to be the leader, who had gotten the Romans back into a fighting spirit. But despite this, they were still heavily outnumbered, given the men they had previously lost. With no allies to bolster their ranks, Caedicius realized that in order to stand a chance, he would need to turn to an enemy. If there was one thing anyone could be certain of during these times, it was raids by the Etruscans. Like clockwork, bands of them came to loot the territory of Veii, and when they did, Caedicius curbed them and took those who could fight as prisoners. There he forced them to lead them to other raiding parties, those who were in turn subdued and absorbed into Caedicius's new makeshift legion. Caedicius then summoned Camillus from Ardea to join forces with him, and Camillus assumed total command of the new Roman force, that which was bolstered by Etruscan renegades. Of course, none of this would be official until it was approved by the Senate. Camillus, who had been banished for his fraudulent crimes, couldn't just absolve himself. So a soldier named Cominius Pontius was ordered to go to the Senate, get their approval, and then come back with confirmation. The Senate, who by this point probably would have agreed to anything given the circumstances, names Camillus as dictator, giving him all the rights and powers to save Rome from the Gaulish invasion. Just like that, a man who was once a disgraced commander had now become dictator, a sign of poetic redemption, perhaps, or a sign of how desperate the Senate was for a victory. But the Gauls were able to ascend Capitoline Hill, perhaps via an ascent that was unknown to the Romans, because they had left it unguarded, and so the Gauls snuck their way onto the summit at night and would have worked their way into the Roman fortress had they not scared the geese that lay nearby. Interestingly, the geese were sacred to the goddess Juno, and it might be said that it was Juno herself warning the Romans that the Gauls had found their way up the hill and were coming to kill them. The geese made so much noise that it disturbed the Romans from their sleep, where they found the Gauls had infiltrated them. Marcus Manlius Capitolinus, a former consul, was thought to have knocked one of the Gauls back down the cliff, and that his flailing body fell into the others who were still ascending, causing a sort of domino effect. Manlius and the waking Roman soldiers were able to subdue the Gauls who had made it onto the summit. It was a close call for the Romans, but luckily, precious Juno, or the geese, had saved them from near death. Caedicius, however, was not so pleased with the outcome. He was outraged that the Gauls had even been allowed up the hill, and demanded to know why this section of the cliff had been left unguarded. In order to appease his anger, the blame fell upon an unnamed soldier, who was subsequently thrown from the cliff. Before too long, both armies began to become afflicted by famine. The Gauls, however, were also suffering from a sudden case of malaria. They had nowhere to go, given that they'd sacked most of the city behind them, and were now trapped in this limbo state, between the ashes behind them and the hill ahead of them. Due to the pestilence, many of the Gauls died. Now it wasn't just the Romans who were eager for this conflict to be over, but also the Gauls. They began to call upon the Romans to surrender, likely hiding the fact that they were succumbing to malaria so that they could hold their position. Livy tells us that they became so eager for a win that they hinted to the Romans that they could be paid off to leave. Evidently, despite their numbers and prowess, the Gauls were not likely to see this siege through to the end, and would probably have perished before the Romans on the hill would. Therefore, they wanted to leave, but likely couldn't do so without at least something to show for it. But the Romans, who were waiting for Camillus to arrive and save them, refused to surrender. Eventually though, talks were said to transpire between Roman representatives on the hill and Brennus of the Senones. Livy tells us that despite their deteriorating health, the Senones were able to negotiate payment to leave in the form of gold, and that it's possible that the Romans were unaware of just how ill the Gauls might have been. It's also understood that the Gauls took more gold than was offered, but when the Romans protested, Brennus drew his sword, a gesture understood by all. Paying off the Senones to leave was absolutely humiliating for the Romans. Never before had such a thing been done by the proud nation, but then never before had they been so totally taken advantage of. It would have no doubt been seen as a great shame for the Romans, and one that they would have a hard time living down. Well, perhaps not such a hard time. You see, as Brennus and the Senones were leaving, Camillus and his mismatched army arrived, and he denied Brennus from leaving, stating that the deal he had made did not count, because it had not been made with him. When Brennus challenged this, Camillus asserted that he was dictator now, and that any deal made with any other Roman was void. He advised them to return the gold and to leave, unless of course the remaining Gauls wished to fight for it. Naturally, the Gauls chose to fight, but in their weakened, diseased state, they were far less of a challenge. Livy wrote, "The slaughter was total, their camp was captured, and not even the messenger survived to report the disaster." Plutarch's account mainly follows Livy's, though appears to be a bit more detailed with the final moments of the encounter, telling us that when Camillus returned and denied the Gauls from taking the gold, there was no space for a battle to take place. Therefore, Brennus and his men were allowed to leave the ruins of the city, but at dawn, Camillus and a small force pursued them, and with the element of surprise, was able to descend upon them and cut them down. While some Gauls did escape, it is understood that they too were eventually murdered by neighbouring Roman towns. Modern historians, meanwhile, debate the whole scenario altogether. Some argue that Rome had been sacked so badly by the Senones that they would not have been able to adequately defend Capitoline Hill at all, let alone assemble an army to retaliate. Another argument disputes the extent of the sacking, and that it probably wasn't as bad as Livy suggested, given that the Roman recovery was quite swift. Furthermore, there does not appear to be archaeological traces of such destruction taking place. Any destruction within the vicinity of the Roman Forum was thought to have taken place during plebeian rebellions, during the reign of the tyrant king Superbus, more than a century prior. Another idea suggests that the Senones were not interested in burning buildings or destroying the Roman architecture, but more likely more in the mind for looting. When Rome did rebuild, it was likely facilitated by the recent conquering of Veii, but despite their building, the fear of the Gauls had well and truly set in. Rome would never quite forget how close it had come to decimation, and it would not be so far-fetched to say that the Romans were hypervigilant to the possibility of future Gaul attacks. Gaulish assaults did take place in the ancient city of Latium, but these were likely just marauder raids that were easily dispersed by comparison. Whilst this was not the last the Romans would hear of the Gauls, it is all we have time for on today's video. Let me know your thoughts on today's video and how well you thought the Romans fared against their tribal adversaries. As always, if you've enjoyed today's episode, then don't forget to give it a like and don't forget to subscribe for more content just like this. Until next time.